All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our SHRM webinar, Riding the Resignation Rollercoaster, hosted by Bullseye Engagement and presented by Towhee Shupka. My name is Nina Mu. I'll be your moderator for today. Go over a few housekeeping items before we begin. So firstly, all participants will begin muted, but this will be an interactive style webinar, so you'll see some polls throughout the presentation, and we really encourage you either unmute yourself or respond to the polls when prompted. There will also be a Q&A time at the end, so feel free to use the question box. We'll try to get through all of them, and you can choose to remain anonymous when you're sending in your questions. And also, this session is being recorded. You will receive the recording and your SHRM certificate of attendance by early next week. So with all that said, if anyone is unfamiliar with Bullseye, I'd like to briefly introduce who we are and what we do. Bullseye Engagement is a cloud-based provider of talent development, employee engagement, succession planning, workforce planning, and business intelligence dashboards. And this is all in one simple, intuitive, integrated portal. And we strive to add value to our clients by enabling a culture of coaching, and that stimulates employee engagement. So if you have any questions about Bullseye or interested in learning more, all of our information will be shared at the end and sent via email. And here we have a list of our clients just to show you that they come from a wide range of industries and have found Bullseye to be helpful in driving business success. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Towhee Shupka. She is a human capital strategy consultant and advisory board member at Bullseye Engagement. Currently, she works with HR consulting firms, HCM, HRIS providers, and talent management entities, providing guidance on client acquisition and retention strategies, which you'll learn more about. She is a senior leader in employee benefits, HR, healthcare, and human service markets, has experience as an executive relationship manager, designing enterprise solutions that meet clients' unique needs and solve business problems. And she's developed strategic programs and services. I'm Nina Mu. I manage customer communications marketing here at Bullseye. I'm here to connect with you if you want to learn more. As I've said, information will be shared at the end. And now Towhee has a lot of valuable insights to share with us, so now I'll hand it over to her.
Thanks, Nina. You forgot to say I'm also a diehard Dave Matthews fan and a Labrador mom.
Oh yes, that part is important.
So welcome. As Nina said, I think most of you are muted, but there is obviously the chat function, so feel free. She'll be monitoring that as we go through, and we have a lot to share with you today. So I just want to start by thanking Bullseye Engagement and its CEO and founder, Adil Zaidi, for inviting me to participate and present on this topic. And I also want to thank the Bullseye team and Nina for all their help in putting this together. It's just been a joy working with the team as usual. So thank you to all. As Nina said, we're gonna move through a variety of topics today that are really focused on the resignation roller coaster. And you can call it the turnover tsunami, you can call it the great resignation. There's lots of different ways to refer to it. But from my perspective, it's really like a roller coaster. It's really, most employers are experiencing ups and downs, unpredicted ups and downs, and they're kind of coming at most employers fast and furious. Our agenda today is, we'll start with talking through some of the drivers of the roller coaster, what's really prompting these fluctuations. We'll go over some warning signs, some ways in which you can monitor your organization and your workforce to see if there are concerns mounting. We'll also tackle some countering strategies. We'll talk through some things that you can do, both to monitor and measure, but also counter any roller coasters that you might be experiencing in your workforce. And then we'll talk a little bit about data mining and the role that it plays in reinforcing your strategies and helping you manage the roller coaster. And then finally, speak a little bit more to Bullseye's capability. And then, as Nina said, we're going to try hard to ensure that there is a Q&A period at the end. So let's start with a polling question. Are you feeling the impact of the resignation roller coaster in your organization? Are you having any of these difficulties that we've identified? Are you having, I should say, any fluctuations in your workforce that you didn't predict or are particularly are providing particular angst to you? I'll give you a second to respond to that. And while you do, I'll start to set the stage for our discussion today. Recently, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported there are still more more jobs than workers available. Shortages and reshuffling are occurring in all segments of the economy, although our research shows in certain segments of the economy, they're being hit harder than others. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be a little later in the presentation. We're also finding that certain populations within the workforce are more transient than previous to the pandemic, and that's also a significant contributor to the fluctuations we're seeing. As an example, if we think about millennials, their resignation rates, according to the Harvard Business Review, have increased more than 20% between 2020 and 2021. SHRM recently reported a study that more than 50% of workers say they are actively job hunting at the moment. That's a 35% increase year over year. And currently, hospitality, retail, and blue-collar sector jobs are more difficult to fill than other areas of the job market. We see that resignations nationally are at a 2-decade high. In August, for instance, of this year, more than 4.5 million workers voluntarily left their jobs. So what's driving the roller coasting? Post-pandemic realities is one area we're going to talk about. We'll talk a little bit about major life changes and the role that that's had on encouraging or causing employees to move around. And then we'll talk a little bit about compensation and benefits as the final factor that is contributing to this. Oh, and I'm looking at the poll. Good, it's closer than I expected it to be. So good, thank you for answering. That's good to see what those numbers look like. So for some of you, it's something you're experiencing currently. For others, this will be something that will be helpful for you to anticipate any potential vulnerability that you have within your organization. So as I said, we're going to look at 3 areas that have emerged as drivers of the workforce fluctuation. Note, some of these areas experts had originally said would be temporary and fast moving. And they're now saying these are concerns or areas that will not subside in the near future. We're going to examine ways to identify and counter these issues as we move through the presentation. But let's start first with COVID-19 and the pandemic. Like any societal crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the landscape of the domestic workforce permanently. If we acknowledge that 1 in 5 households have experienced or are experiencing a COVID-related death, and the New York Times reported that we've now reached over 745,000 deaths to date, we can't ignore that that's had a tremendous impact on our workforce, job market, and society as a whole. The actions of employees are necessarily and definitively affected by a series of post-pandemic realities, both exacerbating some of the historical and creating some immediate trends. The changes in family structures as a result of the pandemic, combined with the natural and planned life changes, such as things like graduations, additional degrees, boomer retirements, lifestyle expectations, have altered the mindset and the needs of many workers and have changed their perspective entirely on career and work. Many employers have come back strong, pivoting their business model, making sure that they have moved in a direction that has kept them surviving through the pandemic, and they're in positions to aggressively tackle recruitment with innovative compensation and benefit strategies. They're acquiring talent successfully, maybe in some circumstances, but others are still attempting to rebound from the very practical implications of the pandemic on their day-to-day operations. So let's start first with the post-pandemic realities. Now, I understand that for some, the idea of the term post-pandemic reality is a little bit controversial. For many of us, we're still living in the pandemic, and I understand that. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we're really talking about the period from February 2020 to now, where 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 workers are reporting that they're actively looking for a new job. The Labor Department recently reported job growth of fewer than 200,000 jobs in September, which was far below the expectations of both the market and labor experts. And much of the realities impacting the labor market and influencing the fluctuations in the job market feel for some like a carnival ride. In September, the US Census Bureau did a pulse survey of non-working adults and found that 4.65 million people indicated the main reason for not working is that they're either actively caring for or sick themselves with coronavirus symptoms, versus the approximately 2 million who reported a similar data point in July. This is also affecting, as many of us realize, it's affecting disproportionately minority and women-led households. According to the Secretary of Labor, Walsh, he's labeled this an unprecedented, he's labeled this time as unprecedented. He's indicated that the behaviors of both job seekers and job posters have changed radically. In-person jobs are regarded as higher risk to many employees and employers. The need to have someone present for a child who is home virtually learning outweighs the desire to enter or return to the workforce. And employees are looking at their jobs as too negatively impactful to their health and to their home. There's a growing chasm between jobs that can and will be performed remotely and those jobs which by nature of the work require on-site work. Population shifting occurred most significantly in metropolitan areas. Many employers have seen that the employees that used to be proximate to their organization have moved out into other communities and are hesitant to re-engage in commuting. Whether it's from fear of exposure to the virus, whether it's other concerns about the expense, or even the time commuting. There's a return to work hesitancy. There's anxieties that are palpable that are affecting many employees as they contemplate whether or not to return to the office. Or if they've been forced to return to the office, they continue to have anxieties about being there and may contemplate a job change for that reason as well. July 2020 also, and I thought this was a really interesting factor, July 2020 saw the single highest number of new business applications ever. We had over 600,000 Americans choosing to pursue new business models of their own in 1 month. The sheer number of new entrepreneurs entering into the workforce and the impact that they're having is just astronomical, and it's just an unbelievable statistic when you think about it. Barron's reports this month that while economists and employers believed much of these fluctuations to be temporary, tying them to both the availability of pandemic benefits and the rapid rate of illness, they assumed that when the decline of infection and the loss of additional benefits happened, that there would be a mass return of workers. And yet we still see 5 million workers who have not returned to the workplace and seemingly have no intention to. The irony of all of this is that there are studies that suggest that post-pandemic household income is higher than pre-pandemic, which is a really interesting factor. For those who've not increased an increase in income, many have restructured their lives. They've gone and figured out how to live on one salary when they never thought they would ever have to. And for 2 million households, for 2 million workers, mainly mothers or caregivers, they have to look at the risk gain calculation and have to decide if the risk is worth returning to the workforce or not. And many are deciding that they are not ready to go. And then finally, if we recall, prior to the pandemic, we were seeing 5 to 6 generations in the workforce. We'll talk in a minute about how the pandemic has affected generations in some specific ways. But it's important to realize that the basic landscape has altered for each generation in different ways. Their views of work-life balance and their views on what they want and what they need out of their employment have changed as a result of the pandemic. So shifting to major life changes, some of these I think are obvious. I think some of these are things that we're seeing in the news left and right, and some of them not so much. One of the most significant things that our research revealed is there's a new perspective on work life and what requirements workers have around work-life balance. Most specifically, there's a real difference between how millennials, who are the largest group of employees in the workforce right now, and retirees or potential retirees are viewing work-life balance. According to the Washington Post, in September 21, 1 in 5 Americans have died from COVID. For many who previously regarded their role as worker central to their sense of self and identity, they found through the pandemic a new sense of self. For some, by choice, and other by circumstance, employees impacted by loss or illness report an experience of reassessing or redefining what they value in work and from their employer. For many, this also means a shift in how they view their job responsibilities and how they view compensation and benefits, which we'll talk about in a minute specifically. Many employees have experienced layoffs and or have been sent home or have a combination of both. There's been a lot of fluctuation in whether or not they'll have a job, and those insecurities have created a desire to be less dependent financially and psychologically on their employment. For those who stayed employed and stayed with their employers, many report unreasonable demands, experiencing symptoms of burnout, and having disproportionate work stress as reasons for their job change. Millennials and retirees pose even more challenges for employers, resulting in more volatility in the rates and changes in employment for those two sectors. We'll look at millennials in a moment, but for the boomers, a couple of unique things happened during the pandemic that are worth commenting on. The first is, like everyone else, they experienced a reassessment of life and the role that work plays in their life, and they started to look at it through a different lens. For many, the housing boom and the fluctuations in the market have yielded opportunities to seize retirement at a time that they had not planned. And balancing that with the fact that with the perceived risk of the virus affecting this demographic and at higher rates than other demographics, have created a higher sense of risk in returning to the workforce. A recent Prudential poll indicated that 68% of those workers surveyed indicated they had the ability to work from home, versus 87% indicating they have a preference to work from home. So there's also a gap between those who have the ability and those who have the desire. And that's something that's going to continue to be impactful as we look at how to retain and or attract workers. So oftentimes job changes hinge on that decision as well. Is there the flexibility for me to work from home or work remotely? And is my employer willing to have that discussion with me? The other thing to think about is that the structure of households, many households have changed indefinitely. As many have lost an income producer, they've become caregivers, they're balancing school and childcare issues at levels they've never experienced before. Additionally, Barron's reports that many families have used the pandemic to save in ways they never saved before. And again, to make lifestyle changes that they hadn't previously anticipated making, becoming sustainable then on one income rather than two. When we think about mental health, in the pandemic, we have to think about that in a way that I don't think we've ever had to think about before as employers or as leaders in organizations. The concern, specifically the anxieties and the angst around the pandemic itself, coupled with all the other concerns and or stressors that our workers have, is really tangible and palpable. Most studies report that it's one of the biggest outcomes, if you will, of the pandemic is workers reporting a higher level of anxiety, a higher level of stress impacting their mental health. It's also altering then the dynamic between the employer and the employee, right? We're seeing workers now insisting that or seeking environments that they feel are more supportive and responsive to their needs. The sheer number of new vendors, apologies. The sheer number of vendors who have emerged in this space of overall mental health wellness, corporate wellness, organizational wellness, really also suggests that there's a radical increase in the demand. I don't know about the rest of you, but on a daily basis, I know I'm receiving information from all sorts of new platforms, software, services, where they're really focused on how do we create and how do we support a conversation in the workplace around mental health wellness. Okay. So I said a minute ago, we talk about generation comparisons, and let's take a look at millennials against Generation X and the baby boomer or the traditionalists. This data comes from SHRM. It was recently released in their most recent HR magazine. And it shows that millennials are the most anxious generation in the workforce, and they are in many ways unique in the types of anxieties that they have in the workforce. So when I thought about this and I started putting this presentation together, it occurred to me that in some ways the pandemic kind of exacerbated trends that we were seeing that were already impacting the job market and talent pools before the pandemic. I recall doing trainings, I recall attending workshops, going to conferences where there was a lot of discussion around the differences between the different generations, the 5, 6 generations in workforces, and the ways in which they viewed, valued, and approached work. If you think about it, the pandemic just sort of accelerated many of those trends. So some of these will seem familiar to you. They're just more extreme than they used to be as a result of the pandemic. For instance, let's talk a little bit about millennials. As I said, SHRM reports on job angst amongst the millennials to be greater than any generation before them. The oldest of the millennials, if you think about what their life experience has been, they've endured 2 economic downturns, the aftermath of 9/11, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the COVID pandemic, not to mention things like emergent climate change concerns, massive student debt, domestic unrest, all of which result in a very different view of their employment and of their world. They're unique, they possess this unique combination of skepticism, distrust of institutions, feelings of entitlement, and a genuine demand for purpose in their lives. And it's forcing employers to look at the issues of benefits and compensations through a different lens. And as I said, some of these things were already there before the pandemic. It's just that the pandemic accelerated and made these issues more intense. If you recognize that they are the largest generation in the market and the largest cohort leaving via voluntary resignation, it becomes important to really think through these areas, these issues of concern for them, and really start to think about how you're approaching compensation and benefits, the culture of your organization, and its overall stated purpose in a way that they're going to hear it and that it's going to resonate for them. And then finally, their views on diversity and equity are much more important to them. It's a bigger imperative for them to work with an employer who has demonstrated a willingness to look at issues of diversity and inclusion in a very significant and tangible kind of a way. In fact, over 50% of millennials will report that they see systematic racism as widespread. And further, studies report that they also believe that it's continually reinforced by older generations continuing to stay in the workforce. And it's interesting, you know, when I was preparing for this presentation, I did a fair amount of research, and that piece of research was one of the most intriguing pieces that I found. Was the idea that they carry with them a predisposition to perceive, or a predisposition to identify systematic and systemic racism, and that they feel in many ways the barrier to overcoming that is really in the transition of older generations out of the workforce. Now, as someone who's not a millennial, I'm not so sure I'm particularly happy about that view. And as someone who knows a bunch of millennials, I'm not sure that that's true of every millennial. But as I said, both Sherm and actually Barron's reported on this, that it's a very significant piece for them. Over 65% of millennials indicate that they have or would change jobs if they perceive their employer had not addressed diversity and equity sufficiently to encourage change, or to make sure that the environment is diverse, inclusive, and accessible and equitable. If you look here too at the three areas that were measured in terms of job angst, if you look at feeling lonely and isolated, if you think about who are the millennials, or what roles are the millennials most likely to play in the economy, many of them are in the gig economy, many of them are already in remote positions, and they're feeling, as a result of the pandemic, far more isolated than they anticipated feeling as a result of the overlay of pandemic guidance and pandemic issues. They, more than any other generation, are wondering if they're being paid enough. And they, more than any other generation, are at a point in their life where they have mounting student debt, and their projected wealth accumulations are trending far behind where they believe and where other generations have been at similar points in their life. And compared to other generations, they are acutely aware that they have options, and they are even more, as a result of the pandemic, willing to exercise those options. They've seen the insecurity, they've seen the fluctuations that have happened in the job market as a further indication that they shouldn't be looking for an all things for the rest of their career type of a position. In fact, their pre-pandemic statistics were that they were generally staying about 2.4 years in a role versus the general statistic of over 7 years for baby boomers or traditionalists. And experts are anticipating that that time frame for millennials will actually go down. It will actually become shorter. They believe that career progress is an entitlement, and they often look to make changes to accelerate their career arc. So if they don't feel that they are moving quickly or quick enough within the organization's ladder, they will begin to become dissatisfied with where they are, and they will look to make a move that will allow them a jump. On the opposite end of the spectrum, baby boomers are more likely to reevaluate the need to continue working. Many of them, as I said earlier, are in positions that have improved as a result of market change. Many have profited by the housing boom, and have been looking for a trigger to retire. And the pandemic has done just that. It's sort of taken it out of a financial question. It's taken it out of a responsibility to my employer question. It's taken it out of this is how I feel fulfilled and good about what I do and how I live my life. And it's brought it into I think I want to not be at work because I perceive it's not, there's a higher risk for me from a health perspective. And then that demographic is more likely to experience illness or loss associated with the virus. So finally, the final factor is compensation and benefits. And when we think about compensation and benefits, I've alluded to some of the things that are important to employees right now and are pandemic, more significant post-pandemic. Flexibility. Employees and job seekers often report that flexibility is a critical issue for them. They've come to understand that their role as a worker has to be balanced differently because of the impacts of the pandemic with the roles of the role that they play as a worker. The role of remote the idea that some positions can and will continue to be remote is attractive to many employees. And for many employers, depending on the nature of the work, one of the biggest challenges that they face. The other thing that's important to note is that millennials are, you know, in all the ways that I've just said, they're really confident in articulating and creating or asserting their influence within their employer, within their workplaces, and they are more willing to express angst, and they're more willing to express their needs than other generations have. So necessarily, it's kind of changing the dynamic between employer and employee. And it's really driving a need to look at compensation and benefits through an innovative eye, looking at whether or not employers are actively demonstrating a desire for employee input and using that input to take action around comp and benefits in a way that seems consistent with the input and seems consistent with the desires. So rather than years ago when an employee would go to an employer and there'd be this predetermined benefit package that was uniform across the organization and was maybe a standard within the field, employees now are saying, wait a minute, I want flexibility also in my benefits. I want flexibility in the options that I have, and I want my employer to demonstrate a willingness to be more aligned with who I am, as opposed to just simply offering traditional benefits. The other thing that's really important to take into consideration is that right now workers are more than ever focused on development and the role that their employer can make or play, excuse me, in functional and cross-functional development, as well as just personal development. So employees are looking more and more at the ways in which their employment can influence their overall development as individuals. Again, I'm sorry, I just hit that too quickly. And then the final piece to just think about is that 18 months of absolute insecurity have led people, particularly millennials, but others, to be far more comfortable taking risks and making changes in their employment status. And they're far more likely to be driven by other than compensation reasons. All right. So that's a lot to think about, and I apologize. It's sort of a dense amount of information and a fair amount of statistics, but I think it's important to sort of note that there are trends emerging. They do fall within those three categories of post-pandemic realities, major life changes, and then views on compensation and benefits. But it's a lot to think about, and it's a lot to balance. Any one of us playing a leadership role in an organization, any one of us as an HR practitioner, that's a lot of different variables to really keep our head focused on, and it can be overwhelming. So where does a responsible employer start? Well, what we would say is a responsible employer starts with identifying warning signs, with thinking through what might be warning signs within their workforce and taking a look at finding ways to measure and monitor that vulnerability within their workforce. So as we kind of run through these, I want you to think a little bit about, okay, what mechanisms do I have in place, if I have them in place, and are there other workforce factors that you think are also equally important to identify as warning signs, and we'll talk about them when we get to the open discussion. So high departmental turnover, and I'm going to circle back to that in a slide in a second to talk, do a little bit of a deeper dive on turnover and the various facets of turnover, but certainly high turnover, however that's defined for your industry, however that's defined for your organization, is a significant warning sign. A reduction in communication. If you're finding that your staff are not nearly as communicative as they have been, if they're not as forthright, if they don't feel as connected with the business objectives and with their team, that can be both an individual and an organizational flag. Unusual fluctuations in performance. If you're seeing high performers or high potential performers suddenly dialing back, or if you're seeing just an erraticness in their performance, that can be certainly an indicator, as well as traditional things like absenteeism, signs of burnout. We referenced earlier major life changes. If I've gone from being, a professional, one of two income members of a household that has now, had to take in elderly parents, has maybe lost a child, is now caring for grandkids, whatever the circumstances are. If major life changes as a result of the pandemic have been forced on your employees, that should be a warning sign for you to start taking a look at whether or not you're vulnerable for some radical fluctuations. One that's also kind of specific to millennials, but not so much, is not entirely, I should say, is this notion of mispromotion. So the notion that, as I said, millennials and others in the workforce want to see tangible advancement. And if you have employees who, if you have an environment where employees haven't had the opportunity to be promoted or haven't had the opportunity to develop, then that can become an area of concern and a warning sign for transitions. And again, both organizationally and individually, and we'll talk about the differences between monitoring the organization and monitoring individuals. So our next polling question is, and we're going to look at the results at the end of the slides, but the next polling question for you to respond to is, in what degree do you believe your organization is aware, prepared, and sufficiently monitoring the fluctuations of your workforce? Give you a minute to respond. We'll move on. Okay, so turnover. I said we'd pause on turnover for a second, and I want to because I think it's the most tangible. It's probably the most universal, if you will, factor that most of us can speak to, and it's obviously one of the most direct factors related to a roller coaster, if you will, in your workforce. So we thank you. Oh, good. All right. So we're gonna look at those results, Nina, right at the end. So I'm going to minimize this for now. So when we think about turnover as a universal metric and a potential warning sign, you want to think about whether or not you have the capacity to measure this metric and whether or not you're measuring it in alignment with your business model. So it may be that you're looking at vacancies. It may be that you need to look at it from job category or function or location. Maybe you're looking at exit data as a more subjective, but regardless, a meaningful metric. Maybe you're looking at longevity and tenure, time to hire and acquire talent. Maybe you measure what it takes to onboard. Maybe you have metrics around your employee lifecycle model or cost to business as it relates to advertising, interviewing, onboarding, training. The bottom line is the metric needs to be meaningful for your organization, which means that most of the time there's some level of customization that you're going to want to do. In other words, you're not going to want to measure everything and have a whole bunch of noise in the data that you're collecting. You want to measure the things that are meaningful given your business objectives. And so our friends at Bullseye were kind enough to give us an example of how a dashboard could be used to monitor different facets of turnover and really visualize the data from a high-level organizational view. So you can see here on the top, we have data in this imaginary company that's organized by division or department or layers of the company. And you might want to create an average rate and then look month to month. You may want to look week to week. In some businesses, you may need, like retail and hospitality, restaurants, you may need to look at that month to month, day to day. You see here the capacity to have some details around the organization. What does this division look like? What are the elements included in the division? And then what's the action plan that we have put in place or we've agreed to respond to whatever issues are happening? And then it's important to have a breakdown. So it's important to have the number, what is my turnover rate and how do I define the rate? And then we want to look at, okay, so what are the reasons people are leaving? What is this turnover break down into? And here we have an example where they've accepted other employment, maybe they ended a temporary position, they had poor performance, low attendance. You want to look at that and say, okay, organizationally, what does that tell me in terms of warning signs? Am I seeing something that is impactful across the organization? Is it specific to a division in an area, or is it specific to a certain kind of turnover? And that gives you a measure of your vulnerability and a sense of whether or not your roller coaster will continue to be extreme. And then you may want to look at the turnover trends that your organization is seeing. Are we seeing more and more turnover that is voluntary or involuntary? And the voluntary number, I would suggest, is going to be more interesting post-pandemic than it ever was before, for all the reasons we've already talked about. So I said we'd talk a little bit about countering strategies. So that's just an example of one type of a metric that you can put in place that's universally impactful, universally relevant, and is important to all of our businesses. So in general, now I want to shift over to talk a little bit more about what you can do using measurement and metrics to counter your risk and to counter if you become if you're in a situation, where you're seeing unpredicted workforce fluctuations. So certainly the advent or the recent rise of the use of stay interviews is a really important strategy to leverage in thinking about how to counter and how to predict your risk in this area. I'm going to talk about that against exit interviews in the next slide, so I'm not going to say much more about it here. I want to move then to realistic alignment between development and goals. So remember I said that the millennials, as well as other workers, are more likely than ever to be invested in their own individual and collective development. So one of the things that we have to sort of mitigate for as a result of the pandemic is the natural and unfortunate event of burnout. Many employees who have stuck with their employers through the pandemic are exhausted. They feel like job expectations have been unreasonable for a period of time, and they're looking for a realignment to occur of their performance expectations and their goals, and they're looking for employers to show them a pathway for developing within the organization. Many workers speak to a concern around the erosion of culture and balancing that with an insecurity around the future. And we talked a little bit about that earlier in the presentation. So frequent communication and frequent efforts to reinforce your culture are more necessary than they ever were. For some of us, we come from the school of over communicate, say it once, say it 10 times, keep saying it, keep beating the drum. This is really critical right now. Folks need to understand what part of the work environment, what part of their role is secure right now, and what parts aren't, and have a trust that that will be communicated to them in a transparent and in a predictable way. We also see an increased need for input. And an increased need for input is married to an increased need or demand. Again, think about the sense of entitlement, the confidence that millennials have and others to voice their concerns. They want to see very tangible efforts by their employer to respond to those concerns. And they want to see employers different from pre-pandemic, acknowledging and creating psychological safety in the workplace. We also see that many workers are looking for a well-defined, and many employers find a well-defined employee life cycle model to be really helpful. Making sure that each phase is defined, measured, and benched within your organization, so employees have an understanding of what they can expect. We see a counter to the flexibility demand. Now we see a lot of accommodations being requested. Employees are really looking to know that their employers have taken time to investigate the accommodation. And if they can't accommodate the accommodation, that they've gone and taken time to investigate it and then explain it. And explain it in a context that is about both the employee and the work that needs to be done. Again, compensation and benefit planning, they're looking for more flexibility in those models, and they're looking for an increase in mental health specific benefits that will positively contribute to the work environment and the culture, and benefits that will positively contribute to their own personal health and welfare. PTO, that's another big issue. We see a lot of organizations changing their PTO strategies as a result of the pandemic, and we see a lot of employees looking for employers who have flexible PTO policies. Educate people managers. I want to pause on that for a second. Any of you who are SHRM members will know that SHRM has come out with a very significant initiative, around educating or certifying people managers. And the reason they've done that pivot is that they came to understand, much like the rest of us, that it can't just be the leadership team and it can't just be the HR practitioners who are involved in these issues and conversant and have at least a baseline understanding. So more than ever, it's time to really think through what roles in your organization are people managers, and to what degree have you supported them and trained them, especially in some of the areas that we're talking about relative to culture, relative to benefit administration, relative to all of these different things. And the reason that's important is because more often than not, they're the first line when they're the first sort of representative of the organization that the employee thinks about when they start thinking about moving. And so it's important that you have confidence that they've got the skills and tools to do what they need to do. And then you want to have a capacity to track engagement and a strategy for encouraging engagement within your organization. And we'll talk about that in the next slide as it relates to the importance of both stay and exit interviews. So here again, our friends at Bullseye were kind enough to provide a sample of the stay interview template, that tool that they have. But let's start just kind of defining the two. For a long time, we just looked at why do people come to our organizations? And then we started to realize there was value in understanding why people were leaving. And we began to understand that should be captured both subjectively and objectively, right? We want to look at what's the cause of the resignation, and we want to understand what was going on in terms of the employee's experience, and have a sense of how they'll speak to their experience at your organization, because that will or could impact your reputation. It's also important because when we do exit interviews, alums are not only more likely to speak positively about us, but they're also more likely to seek return employment. And sometimes with our top talent, it hurts when they leave, and we'd love to get them back. So exit interviews are good, and they have a huge value. But with respect to the topic of conversation we're having today, I really want to focus on stay interviews, and why stay interviews are critical for your company as it relates to predicting whether or not you have a potential roller coaster or in a roller coaster ride. Stay interviews give you real-time information that translates both to the individual and to the organization. And it gives you a sense of whether, if deployed appropriately, whether or not the employee feels valued, is engaged, that they feel heard, that they're satisfied with the direction or the feedback or the responses that the company is taking to their feedback. It can inform how to make real-time improvements or immediate improvements on onboarding processes, promotional processes, development processes. If you think about periodic stay interviews being administered, and at the various points an employee might be in their career with you, you're able to then solicit information that can be really useful in terms of looking at processes that impact their desire to stay or leave. And it can also provide really critical metrics for HR. You know, we made a really big shift, right? Over the last few years, we really, and especially because of the pandemic, we really arrived at the decision-making table, and we're being pressed more and more to help our organizations define their human capital strategies in ways that we were never pushed before. And that means understanding the value and being able to articulate metrics and measurements that can be used and acted upon. And it finally allows you to really take a look at a proactive approach to addressing what could potentially be an organizational vulnerability or an individual talent change, because you're missing something. You can't have your eye on everything all the time. As an example from the Achievers Workforce Institute, I want to just tell you, just to kind of give you a sense of how this data is different. Employees consider, from this report, employees consider leaving their current jobs. The top 3 reasons are better benefits, number 1, better work-life balance, number 2, and the lack of recognition of work as number 3. And lack of recognition, parenthetically, would also mean burnt out, feeling like they've had too much asked of them, not being appreciated, recognized, so forth. Employees report that they stay at their current job first because the work-life balance works for them. Second, because they feel recognized, their work is acknowledged. Third, comp and benefits. So knowing this allows you to prioritize resources and strategy. This leads us back to data visualization and mining, and going back to the simple questions of what matters to you and your organization, your business, how do you align it with your human capital, and what efforts are you making to measure it and use it. Don't just measure, and don't just measure everything, measure and use. And then ask yourself, do you have a complete picture from your data analytics, or are you pulling data from 6 different sources, playing with spreadsheets, doing all sorts of crazy backflips and calculations with your fingers and toes? Or do you have a place where you can go and get a view of your organization's human capital, what their experience is, what their engagement is, what their future thoughts are, and where your individuals are at in terms of potential talent and contribution?
Sorry, don't mean to interrupt, but just one last thing. After we show this, we're going to have our Q&A. We're at our 10-minute mark, and I don't want to let people not be able to answer questions. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to do these last 2 slides and then we're done. Okay. So this gives you a view, thank you though. This gives you a view into an individual team. So here on the left, you would have John Adams' individual information about himself. You would have information here and able to look at action plans, appraisals, check-ins, competencies, trainings he's attended. You can look at the check-in history and whether or not an employee has goals, whether or not they have aspirations. If you're not seeing a lot of that, then that kind of says, I'm not sure they're really engaged with what we're doing. And then do you have the capacity to then roll all that data up into an integrated organizational visualization? And so here's an example here where we've got data on headcount, we've got data on leadership and human capital performance, we've got data on diversity, recruiting, KPIs, so on and so forth. Do you have a way to kind of pull it all up, roll it up, and look at it from a high view? So it really just comes down to all of this. Couldn't the ride be smoother if we just engage in these activities in some systematic way within our organization? So with that, I'll shift to questions, and thank you all for your attention. But Nina, let's go ahead and bring up that poll just so that the poll results, so that folks can see that, and then we'll run through what questions may have come up.
Yeah, for sure. The poll is being displayed.
Can you all see it? So we have 25% said you felt you were extremely aware, prepared, and monitoring the fluctuations in your workforce. 63% said you are moderately aware, prepared, and monitoring. 0 said poorly, and 13% said it's not on our mind. So that's a good indication that there's opportunity to improve, and that many of you are already tackling much of these issues. Nina, what were our questions?
So does anyone have questions they would like to put into the chat? And I think Adil said he had one. Can wait for that.
Oh, when I'm looking at the chat, so I knew there were a few folks on the webinar that were colleagues and friends. So thank you, and thanks for those that sent messages. I appreciate you taking time to be with us today. I hope it was helpful. But yes, do we have any questions? Adil, did you have something you wanted to throw out?
You can either post it in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
Oh,
if you like.
I see Daniel. Dan, do you have a question?
I think no, he just
okay.
said he sees the poll.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks.
Go
Dan.
ahead, Adil.
Towhee, good afternoon, and highly appreciate such an informative and full of advice, packed 1 hour. Your research is much appreciated, I'm sure, by all our viewers and listeners out there. My question is that based on all your research, what should leadership be doing actively, and what role does stay interviews and frequent communication between leadership and employees play in this volatile stage where we're looking at over 4 million resignations in the last few months?
Sure. No, great question. So I'm going to tackle stay interview first, and then I'll back into what leadership should be doing. So with respect to stay interviews, I would highly recommend that organizations have a mechanism for regularly conducting stay interviews. And I would recommend that there's value in both anonymous or not, suggesting that anonymous, you're probably more likely to get far more feedback, candid feedback, as we kind of all know. I would probably couple stay interviews, whether it's a pandemic time or not, with my strategic planning activities as an organization. So I would want to look at completing stay interviews at some predictable interview so that over time I can see net change, and I can also align that with the actions that my organization takes to forecast, to predict, to plan, to budget, if you will, for human capital and human capital strategies. Backing up to leadership and what should leadership be doing. So there's lots of application for stay interviews. And as I said, I think it's important that an employee almost over their tenure with your organization take more than one, and take more than one over time. What should leadership be doing? Leadership should be asking itself first and foremost, do we think we have a risk here? Do we have a risk already? Are we already struggling with the human capital that we have, and there being changes in that? And are those changes predictable or unpredictable? And if they're unpredictable, then I would say you need to back into what are the metrics that will give you the warning signs that we talked about. What metrics can you put in place to see if absenteeism is going up, if disengagement is going up, if satisfaction and connection and communication is going up, is turnover varying, and also couple that with certainly what it takes to acquire talent, and of course that's a different strategy. But I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, and once again, thank you so much, Towhee. This has been very informative talk from you, and a great research work. I would like to thank you on behalf of everyone here at Bullseye, and I'm sure that Nina, you can probably unshare the screen.
Yeah, if there's any other questions, certainly feel free to reach out to Nina, feel free to reach out to me. This is the final slide here where it indicates that you will receive the certificate of attendance, and you will also receive a recording of this presentation. But certainly the team at Bullseye is well prepared to work with you on ways to get more tangible as it relates to this measuring and monitoring.
Yeah. Thank you again, Anina. Please take it over. All yours.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you everyone for participating, and everyone will be receiving a certificate showing that you have attended and received 1 professional development credit for your SHRM certification. And yeah, thank you all for coming. Have a great day. Thank you again, Towhee. Appreciate everything. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.